Joining me now is Jerry Mitchell. He's the legendary investigative reporter and the author of Race Against Time. A reporter reopens the unsolved murder case of the civil rights era. And Jerry, it's great to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and that's no exaggeration. Your work played a central role in bringing the killers to justice in the assassination of Medgar Evers, the firebombing of Vernon Dahmer, the 16th Street church bombing that killed 4 little girls in Birmingham. You won only 30 awards though, including the MacArthur Genius Grant and Columbia's John Chancellor Award. And if I kept going, we'd take up the whole show. So, Jerry, how did you get involved in those civil rights era cases to begin with? And how much after they happened did you pick up the story?
Well, I mean, it was 1989, January of '89, and I went to see the movie Mississippi Burning. I was assigned to cover it, and happened to be 2 FBI agents who investigated the case there. And I guess what I couldn't wrap my head around is there were more than 20 Klansmen involved in killing these 3 young men, James Chaney, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and nobody had ever been prosecuted for murder. That was just something I just couldn't wrap my head around. Yeah. And really, it was woefully ignorant about the civil rights movement and all the violence attached to it. I mean, I knew some of it, but not much.
So that's back in '89. Obviously, the murders happened.
64.
64 in the Mississippi Burning case, and 63 with Medgar Evers, right, and the Birmingham bombing. So you got to go back at that point, 26, 25 years, etc. Who are you working for at the time?
At the time, and this whole time I was working on these cases, was working for the Clarion Ledger, which is a statewide newspaper in Mississippi. And what I didn't know when I began my journey was basically the role of the newspaper itself in some of these horrible things that happened in the past. Because the Clarion Ledger was a pretty racist newspaper. And so part of discovering some of these things from the past, the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission papers included that newspaper as well.
So I'm actually super interested in that. Did you grow up in Mississippi or no?
I actually grew up in East Texas, schizophrenic town of Texarkana, so that's where
okay,
I grew
gotcha.
Up, yeah.
So you go to the Clarion Ledger and go, hey, by the way, I'd like to look at a case from 25 years ago. Well, I'm surprised, and it might, by the way, unearth the fact that you guys were terribly racist. So how in the world did they even give you permission?
Well, it's not like I walked out and walked in one day and said all that. It was more one story at a time. It was like one thing led to another. The Sovereignty Commission stuff was about a month later after the movie that I ran across that and began to open my eyes to a lot of horrible things that happened.
What's the Sovereignty Commission?
It was a state segregationist spy agency in Mississippi that basically infiltrated civil rights groups, spread propaganda, sent speakers black and white up north to talk about how wonderful segregation was. And it was essentially kind of the state version of the White Citizens Council.
And how long was that around?
It started not long after the White Citizens Council was established. And then it ended in 1977, and when the Mississippi legislature officially abolished them, but this is the part you'll love. So they said the Mississippi legislature sealed all those records, more than 132,000 pages of records, and that they sealed for 50 years. So my first thought, of course, when I found that out was, well, there's something in there, right?
Oh, yeah. You don't seal something for 50 years.
Exactly.
Unless you really don't want it getting out. That's like when Trump came out of the meeting with Putin was like, and told the translator, give me all your notes. Like if you thought there was wonderful stuff in there, you wouldn't care to confiscate the notes.
You want to keep it. So that's what they did. So I began to develop sources that had access to those files, began to leak me those files. And they showed at the same time, the state of Mississippi was prosecuting Byron D. LeBeckwith for murdering Medgar Evers. This other arm of the state, the Sovereignty Commission, was secretly assisting the defense trying to basically help Beckwith get acquitted.
Wow, so back in the 60s, when they're going after
64,
when they're going after the killer, the government is secretly helping the defense instead of the prosecution.
Bingo.
Jesus. Okay, so
and there was other stuff too, but that's one.
Yeah.
Of them,
So are those old records? Was that your main source for unearthing a lot of what happened?
Some of the early stuff, and then that led to other stuff, FBI records and other things I was able to get my hands on.
So when you find that information out about them, what happens next? You write it, presumably you write it in the paper.
I wrote a story. And then one of the people who had read the documents eventually at some point at least gave me a hint. And basically he told me that it involved murder. And so that kind of put me down that trail. I wanted to get those records and eventually loaded up the back of my little Honda with 2,400 pages of the record. And so we ended up doing this huge series of stories including a story about the newspaper itself.
So, okay, then all this stuff comes out. Now, again, there's a number of different cases here.
Yeah, there's several different things.
Yeah, but in the Byron Della Beckwith case,
it gets reopened. It gets reopened and reprocessed.
So that's not Mississippi Burning. Just so I want everybody to be clear. That's Medgar Evers killing. Medgar Evers, the civil rights leader. Della Beckwith kills him.
I went and interviewed him.
Okay. So before I get to how the case got reopened,
sure.
So you go to interview him. What happens there?
So I went to interview him. This was in April of 1990. I spent about 6 hours with him. Absolutely the most racist person I ever spent serious time with. N-word this, N-word that, very anti-Semitic, and believed
really?
Yeah, well, no shock on any of this, but believed all non-white people were what he called mud people. He was a part of Christian identity. I'm sure you know about that, and pretty vile, reprehensible beliefs. And so, I got done talking to him, and it was dark, and he insisted on walking me out to the car, and I'm like, really, that's okay.
I can't wait to leave, but definitely not with you.
And so he gets me, he walks me out the car, he gets me out there and says, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. God does not punish you directly. Several individuals will do it for him.
Oh, he said that to you?
Yeah, he said that to me.
Wow, and you printed that?
Not at that point, actually, but I did get rid of the sandwich his wife gave me.
Okay, so, at what point did they reopen the case?
They reopened it actually with my early stories. It was a series of events. I wrote the story, and then Merle Evers asked for the case to be reopened. The Jackson City Council asked for the case to be reopened. So by the end of October of '89, that case was reopened.
So for the folks who don't know, what wound up happening to Della Beckwith?
So Byron Della Beckwith was indicted for the murder of Medgar Evers in December of 1990 and was convicted because of court machinations. The trial wasn't until 4 years later. He was convicted February 5th, 1994 and sentenced to life in prison.
That's wonderful. I lost track after that. Did he die in prison?
He did. He died in 2001 in prison.
Okay, that's fantastic. Okay, then after you do that case, do you move on to Mississippi Burning?
Well, after Byron Della Beckwith got indicted, these cases kind of overlapped slightly. After Byron Della Beckwith got indicted, all these families, for obvious reasons, say, well, wait a minute, what about my father or my siblings or whatever? And so the Vernon Damer family came to me at that point, and he was a NAACP leader in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is about an hour and a half south of Jackson, totally dedicated to voting rights. Not many people probably know who he is or have heard of him, but he basically died defending his family in a Klan attack. Like they set the house on fire, began firing the guns in the house. He woke up, grabbed his shotgun, and ran from the house and fired at the Klansmen so his family could escape safely out the back window. But unfortunately, the flames of this fire seared his lungs, and he died later that day.
Yeah, so let's talk about the broader picture then, because
sure.
I don't.
Yeah, we could go down to each of these cases.
No, and all the cases are amazing. I mean, they killed those innocent little girls in the church.
Girls.
Yeah, and so they're terrorists. I mean, that's literally terrorists.
They should have been using that term. It's only recently you're starting to hear that term used for. It's like someone from here wasn't a terrorist, but if they're from overseas, then they're a terrorist.
Yeah. No, the Klan is clearly the biggest terrorist organization in American history. There's no question about that. The only people who wouldn't admit that are racists. I'm keeping it real. So I don't know why you would even want to defend the Klan. I mean, they lit things on fire, they bombed things, they shot people they disagreed with politically.
Absolutely.
It had also not only a political component, but a religious component.
Right.
So there's no ands, ifs, or buts, and certainly the largest we've ever had in this country, not even close. Okay, so, but it's hard for people to wrap their minds around how it was back in Mississippi back in the day.
Yeah.
And back in the day is not that long ago.
It's in my lifetime.
Oh yeah, and in 1960, I was born in 70, right?
Right.
And so the commission gets shut down in 77. Until then, they're still, secretly helping every racist they can in Mississippi, even if they know, or because they know they lynched black people. So, and now people say, oh no, it's magically all gone away. But
it hasn't really gone away. I mean, that's the problem with it. The hate hasn't really gone away.
Yeah, so let's catch up to present day in a minute. But for first, I'm super interested in the Clarion Ledger's role in it.
Sure. Well, the Clarion Ledger was, like I said, was very much a racist newspaper in the 50s and the 60s. And then it was owned by the Hederman family, and then Ray Hederman came in the 70s and really began to turn that paper around. Ray now owns the New York Review of Books. That's what he runs now. But he was the one who really helped turn the paper around. So the paper had turned around, substantially by the time I arrived in '86.
So obviously they let you do the stories, and it even exposed some of the things they had done in the past. But back when they were a racist paper,
right?
Did they admit they were a racist paper?
No, of course not. No.
Okay. So what would they do? What they just would?
Oh, I'll give you an example. Like for example, the March on Washington in August of 1963. The day after, I guess AP had a photo of kind of some of the trash around or whatever after and literally on the front page, they printed a photograph of the trash and it said, and I apologize for how offensive it is, but it said Negro trash taken out in Washington. That was literally the headline.
Yeah. So it's almost as if there might be people on a certain cable channel right now talking about how immigrants bring in too much trash and that they're dirty and that the trash needs to be taken out.
Well, yeah.
Interesting. I'm sure totally coincidental parallel. Yes, that's Fox News and their host talking about immigrants. So, but back then, if you said to them, "Hey, look, you're painting African Americans as trash, etc." My guess is like some folks in the media today, like, "How dare you?" No, I'm just covering them. There was trash. There was trash, right? And so
it was pretty awful. It was pretty racist. So, and that's far from I could give many examples of racism.
Give us one more, because look, we talk a lot on the show today about present day propaganda, and it's not just Fox News.
No.
So when the mainstream media says that they like Joe Biden better, they don't say they like Joe Biden better. They say Joe Biden is more electable. They don't say they dislike Bernie Sanders because he would raise their individual taxes for every cable news host. They say Bernie Sanders is socialist and likes Fidel Castro, even though he says the same thing as Barack Obama about Fidel Castro in Cuba. And Fox News doesn't say we loathe immigrants because they're brown.
Right.
They say they bring in, they're potential terrorists and they bring in trash. So I'm curious, what did they say and what did they mean back in the day?
Well, I mean, here's another example. I mean, this is like pretty awful too. They, for example, when James Meredith was admitted to the University of Mississippi in fall of '62, one of the columnists for the Clarion Ledger actually wrote something along the lines of that the federal marshals were fighting each other over who was going to get to give Meredith a bath. Like, this is literally what they wrote in a column. Mm-hmm. And then another column, which actually ran in the sister paper, the Jackson Daily News, compared civil rights activists to chimpanzees. I mean, this was common. I'm not telling you something that was uncommon in those days.
Yeah. And then a candidate came by many decades later and said, oh, in the good old days, these kind of protesters would have been taken out on stretchers and maybe given a bath, right? He didn't add that part. But so here we are again. Every once in a while now, folks without this historical context, and it's almost never talked about, people know it existed. It's not like you don't hear about civil rights era in the history books in college and in high school. You do, but you don't get into a lot of uncomfortable details.
I think that's true because people reduce it down. They make it. Rosa Parks sat down, Dr. King stood up, and African Americans got their rights. I mean, that's what it gets reduced down to. And people don't know their history. They don't really know. It's amazing how many people have read my book so far, and that's what they've responded. They've said, black and white, have said, I didn't know all this happened. Even someone in the civil rights movement who read my book said, I thought I knew this.
So to what degree were African Americans brutalized? Was it, hey, there was one crazy guy and he went after Medgar Evers, and there was 3 crazy guys and they went after da-da-da?
It was a campaign against African Americans. They were purposefully, I mean, you really have to go back in time to the history of how this all originated. It was basically the reestablish of white supremacy in 1890 Constitution was a rebellion against Reconstruction, establishment of the 1890 Constitution, and basically the idea behind it, and they said it out loud, was they were going to reinstitute white supremacy and basically disenfranchise African Americans. They said this out loud. That's why they set up the Constitution of Mississippi that had poll taxes, passed a state law that removed everybody from the voting rolls so then they could keep them from getting back on the voting rolls, and had a constitutional quiz, different things that were kind of, the old line of how many bubbles in a bar of soap, those are the kind of questions sometimes that the clerks would ask to keep them from getting on the voting rolls. So if you understand that context and that history, it was a long time. It was a long period of time that this was going on.
Purging the voter rolls based on names and other things. They wouldn't do that today. Oh, right, they do it today. Okay, anyway. So, but I'm curious, 1890, Mississippi says, yeah, we're for white supremacy.
Right.
What does the federal government do? Because that's illegal, like some of the things
it was totally illegal, but the US Supreme Court said okay to the Mississippi Constitution. It actually got challenged constitutionally. And the US Supreme Court basically said, okay, just like and it was a year before Plessy versus Ferguson, which we know said separate but equal is fine. Which of course it was never equal, but anyway, that was.
Right, so when the establishment, including the United States Supreme Court says something's okay, whether it's racism or corporations being human beings able to bribe politicians, then it's okay. And everything goes along for 100 years of brutality.
Right.
And so how much were African Americans brutalized in Mississippi in that time?
Well, Mississippi had mortal lynchings of African Americans than any other state. I think the Brian Stevens, his group, I think they came up with a total of about 4,000 lynchings of African Americans between basically Reconstruction and civil rights movement.
What would people get lynched for?
Looking at a white woman,
whether they did or didn't.
Whether they did or didn't, or there were false accusations all the time. There were many times where people didn't do anything, literally.
So if you're living in a situation where the law is against you, the government is against you, the courts are against you, and you could be lynched for anything,
exactly.
You would live in perpetual terror.
Yes.
Because if I go out today and I accidentally look the wrong way, or even if I didn't, they might. And by the way, if you don't know the details of lynchings, I've talked about on the show before, and it's the most grotesque thing you'll ever hear. I'm going to tell you because you should know. Sometimes they would just hang them. Sometimes they would hang and burn them. Sometimes they'd have a picnic around the hanging and the burning.
Yeah, they would take photographs. They would take souvenirs. That was the other thing.
Yeah, and if you don't know what the souvenirs were, it was body parts. That from the charred bodies. And they would keep it at home. Hey, this is the black person we burned to death at the picnic. But those things are too uncomfortable to talk about, so nobody talks about them. And that's why these cases also were swept under the rug. Okay. And then you came along, and some people have described you as a, quote, pain in the ass.
That's fine.
And a loose cannon. That's why I love the work that you've done, because until a pain in the ass comes along and says, no, you're not supposed to sweep this under the rug. What happened was an outrage.
Exactly.
Nothing ever gets done. In fact, speaking of Birmingham, this quote's been going around lately, and I've been part of the people who've pushed it. MLK wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail that the white moderate was worse than the KKK and the White Citizens Council.
That's what he said.
That's right, because therefore a negative piece of maintaining order as opposed to a positive piece brought to you by justice.
Right.
Right? And so, seeking justice. I mean, Jerry, you're being such a loose cannon by doing that, making people uncomfortable. So now let's talk about today because we're going to run out of time. So that legacy, and this is the heritage that some people say they're so proud of, right? That is still around today, but of course people don't get lynched in that brutal way that they did, et cetera. So what remains of that heritage?
Well, I think the hate remains. And hate is rooted in fear a lot of times. And so that's what you really see a lot of right now is kind of the rhetoric of fear that's taking place. And when people fear, they dehumanize. When you dehumanize people, you give yourself permission to get rid of them either figuratively or literally. You're doing society a favor. If they're a quote monster, or however you depict them, make them less than human in some way.
So when I interviewed David Duke, I thought he was going to go on a warpath against Latinos and Muslims because that was back in 2015 when Trump's talking a lot about that and he was supporting Trump, but he didn't. He actually mainly focused on Jews.
Yeah.
And I was taken aback by that, and that was of course foreboding. And as we saw, that foreboding sign turned into Charlottesville and the synagogue shootings.
Yeah, there's been a real rise in anti-Semitic, violence and threats.
So when you look at the state of Mississippi now, is it still the main focus African Americans because that's what it was for so long? Or is the hatred, the fear now shifting towards Latino immigrants, Muslims, Jews? Any sense of that?
Well, the populations are just very low for Latino and the Jewish population is pretty low in Mississippi. So not that they haven't had that. I mean, the Klan kind of turned on the Jews in the 60s after kind of the African Americans were targeted. They began to bomb synagogues, began to bomb Jewish leaders' homes. So that was a part of that legacy as well.
Right. So there's still the distrust of African Americans. And I'm gonna end on this.
Sure.
It's amazing to me the stereotypes in this country. They're usually the exact opposite of reality, right? So the horribly offensive term now, Indian giver. Wait, we violated every treaty we did with Native Americans, but then we called them Indian givers. They say Mexicans are lazy. Wait, they're doing the hardest work in the country. So African Americans, they say, are violent after they lynch them, enslave them. And we haven't even gotten to the rape because that's the most uncomfortable part. Right. Even, and then and you can go on forever for all the brutality that was done to African Americans in this country. But because of the propaganda passed down from generation to generation, and yes, the press, and yes, the government in places like Mississippi, do they still really believe that the African Americans are the violent ones?
I think a certain core of people do. I think there are a certain core of people that believe that. Whether they would state it openly in this age or not, I don't know. But I think they inherently distrust. There's this inherent distrust of African Americans. There's just a racial divide there. Yeah.
If an alien landed on Earth and they said, "Wait, which one should distrust the other one?"
Right. Exactly.
Like, wait, how is this a question? Of course, African Americans should distrust the white folks in Mississippi, given the history, the legacy, and what's happening today. But no, it's reverse. White people in Mississippi, not all of them, by the way, not all of them, of course, right? But unfortunately, there's still a culture of like, I don't know about those African Americans. They're a little dangerous, and we can't trust them.
Like I said, it goes back to fear. And for example, Sam Bowers, who's the head of the Klan in Mississippi, talked about before Freedom of Summer about there being an invasion. And of course, that's exactly what the guy in El Paso supposedly went and did. He's protecting us from an invasion. So I find it's interesting the language being similar to the same.
All right, you guys, you got to check out Race Against Time. That's Jerry's book about all these cases. It's amazing, and it's by all accounts thrilling. Like it's almost like you're in a John Grisham novel, but it's actual real life, and of course it's also tragic. And it's an important story that you should know, and I guarantee you will find things in there that you did not know. So Jerry Mitchell,
thanks so much for
thank
having
you
me.
so much,
Appreciate it
man.
very much.
Not only for coming on here, but for doing all these stories and
Thank
for
you very
being
much.
a great, great journalist that uncovered the truth and brought us some justice. 2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.